In the winter of 1941, deep inside Japanese-occupied Manchuria, a research base looked like an ordinary military hospital, but it wasn't. It was Unit 731, a place where doctors no longer healed, they experimented. Every wall hid something the world was never meant to see. Dr. Kenji Sato, a young physician, thought he was saving lives by serving his empire. Within weeks he realized no one here wanted to save anyone. When German officers arrived and recoiled at what they saw, Kenji discovered a forged ledger with his own name on it, and someone wanted him erased. Dr. Kenji Sato's train arrived in Manchuria before sunrise. The cold felt sharper than anything he had known in Tokyo. The station was empty except for soldiers in white coats and armed guards. When he asked where the hospital was, a driver simply pointed to a fenced compound on the horizon. From a distance it looked peaceful, smoke rising, flags waving, but as he drew closer, he noticed the barbed wire and the lack of noise. No ambulances, no patients, only locked doors and people avoiding eye contact. Inside, the corridors gleamed with disinfectant and secrecy. Kenji was told to report to Laboratory Block 3, where medical officers handled special cases. He passed rooms labeled with single numbers, each door sealed with metal clamps. At first glance, it resembled an efficient military facility. But something about the silence didn't fit. Not even footsteps echoed normally. A man in a gray coat led him forward without speaking. When they reached the end, he opened a door to reveal surgical tables without anesthesia machines. Kenji met Colonel Ishida that same morning. The man smiled with military precision, shaking his hand as if greeting a guest of honor. He praised Kenji's academic record and said Japan needed minds like his. Then he told him they were developing methods to keep soldiers alive in extreme conditions. The phrase sounded noble, but when Kenji glanced at the nearby folder, he saw photographs that didn't belong in any medical report. Limbs frozen, skin blackened, faces covered. Ishida shut the folder calmly and welcomed him to the future of warfare. His first task was to observe frostbite recovery experiments. He watched soldiers pour water over restrained captives, measuring how long the skin stayed attached to bone before breaking. The results were recorded neatly on charts, like data from a normal trial. Kenji stood behind the glass, unable to speak. The supervising officer said it was necessary to understand hypothermia. When one man's body stopped moving, the officer scribbled a note. Termination point confirmed. Kenji realized he was witnessing death as procedure, not accident. He tried to tell himself it was temporary, that this was research for soldiers in the field, but each report listed civilian test subjects. The word replaced names. The numbers grew daily. At night, Kenji sat in his quarters reading letters from home, trying to believe he still worked in medicine. The next morning, a nurse quietly asked if he wanted tea. Her name was Aiko, and her hands shook as she poured it. When she glanced around to ensure no one watched, she whispered, "Don't ask who they are." Kenji began writing private notes about each experiment, hiding them inside a pocket notebook. He described only the technical aspects, avoiding names, as if detachment would protect him. Colonel Ishida commended his attention to detail and invited him to dinner with senior officers. Over rice and sake, they discussed biological potential as if it were a business venture. When Kenji mentioned the ethics of testing on civilians, Ishida laughed softly and said that science required sacrifice. The word sacrifice echoed long after the dinner ended. Days turned into routine. Prisoners arrived by truck at dawn. Guards unloaded them like cargo. The laboratory operated in shifts, night and day. Kenji saw colleagues smoking while dissecting lungs, laughing about measurements. To survive, he imitated their indifference. But every new file he opened carried the same faint smell, disinfectant mixed with decay. He began to notice that the subjects often came from nearby villages. Some looked barely old enough to speak. Every time he looked away, another signature bearing his initials appeared on a report. When he finally confronted the records clerk about the signatures, the man told him that paperwork moved faster when names matched authority. It meant someone had been forging his approval to process experiments without his consent. Kenji felt trapped between obedience and outrage. Reporting it would be suicide. Staying silent made him complicit. That night, he couldn't sleep. He stared at the flickering light bulb above his bed, thinking about how easily truth could be rewritten by a stamp and a pen. A week later, rumors spread that German observers were coming from Berlin. The staff was told to clean every lab, prepare charts, and make results impressive. Ishida claimed it was a chance to show Japan's strength to their allies. Kenji overheard others whisper that even the Nazis were hesitant about certain methods, but Ishida dismissed them. He said the Germans admired discipline, not hesitation. Kenji felt something shift inside him. If what they were doing could shock even their allies, what kind of work was he part of? On the day the visitors arrived, a convoy of black cars stopped outside the compound. Officers stepped out wearing thick coats, their faces unreadable. One introduced himself as Dr. Weiss. He shook Ishida's hand with a stiff politeness, but his eyes scanned the yard like a man expecting ghosts. During the tour, Kenji followed quietly, noticing how the Germans flinched at the smell that leaked from certain rooms. When they reached the cold chamber, Weiss muttered something in German that sounded more like disbelief than praise. That night, the Japanese officers hosted a banquet for their guests. Weiss barely touched his food. Ishida gave a speech about scientific progress and mutual goals. The Germans responded with polite applause but avoided meeting anyone's eyes. Kenji sat at the far end of the table, watching Weiss stare at his hands throughout the dinner. Afterward, Ishida approached Kenji, smiling. He said the Germans had a lot to learn from Japan's efficiency. The compliment made Kenji's stomach tighten. He wondered what efficiency meant to men who no longer looked human. Later that week, Kenji received a sealed envelope in his office marked personal. Inside was a document outlining experiments signed under his name. He didn't recognize any of the descriptions. It included procedures that went far beyond his assigned work. The bottom carried an additional line in small handwriting. Approved for demonstration, Dr. Sato. He stared at it for an hour before realizing the ink wasn't his. Someone had written his name to cover for something he hadn't done, and it was now part of the official record. He confronted the records office again, but the clerk avoided his eyes and said it came from above. That phrase meant it was untouchable. Kenji began to panic in silence. Every forged signature tied him closer to something he didn't control. He burned a copy of the document in his trash bin but knew the original still existed in military archives. When he returned home that night, his notebook was missing from his drawer. The only thing left behind was a blank ledger with his name printed neatly on the cover. Kenji decided to start over. He bought a small notebook from a supply store in the nearest town, far from the compound. On his way back, he saw villagers staring at army trucks filled with crates labeled medical supplies. The same trucks carried no supplies when they returned. Back in his quarters, he began a new record, one not for data, but for truth. He wrote in code describing what he saw every day, from the freezing chambers to the injection tests. He called it his ledger of the living. The next morning, he entered the main laboratory and noticed the Germans again. Dr. Weiss was there, watching a new test begin. His expression had changed. There was no disgust anymore, only study. Ishida introduced him as a collaborator. Weiss nodded toward Kenji, saying nothing. When the test ended, Weiss left the room quickly, refusing to speak. Later, Kenji found a German note slipped into his pocket. It read, "You're not the only one keeping records." That was the moment he realized both sides feared the same secret. Kenji examined the German note under the dim lamp in his room. The handwriting matched Dr. Weiss's signature from the visitor ledger. It meant the Germans were documenting everything too, but for whom? If Berlin was shocked, why were they still participating? He realized both sides were building archives not for truth, but leverage. Power disguised as data. He placed the note inside his coded notebook and locked the drawer. That night, soldiers patrolled longer than usual. Someone had reported a leak, and every locked door in the compound was being checked. The next morning, Colonel Ishida called for an inspection of all personal records. Staff were ordered to submit journals and letters for security review. Kenji handed over an empty notebook he had prepared as a decoy. His real ledger stayed hidden inside a vent behind his bed. When Ishida flipped through the pages and found nothing, he smiled and praised Kenji's loyalty. Yet the colonel's tone carried something else. He already suspected. Kenji kept his face blank, knowing even nervousness could end a life here. The inspection continued into the night. At dawn, a soldier delivered a sealed crate to Kenji's lab labeled biological materials. Inside were frozen vials and an envelope containing the next experiment order. The description was far worse than anything before. It required a direct infection test using live subjects. Kenji felt his throat tighten as he read the list of materials required. He realized the prisoners weren't numbers anymore. They were specific individuals chosen for this procedure. The order bore his signature again, identical to his handwriting. Whoever was doing this wanted him completely tied to their crimes. He tried to confront Ishida but was stopped by guards outside the command office. When he demanded to speak, the guard told him the colonel was in a meeting with the Germans. From the hallway, Kenji heard muffled voices, one speaking Japanese, the other with a German accent. He caught a few words: cooperation, progress, transfer of knowledge, then laughter. It wasn't the laughter of celebration, it was acknowledgement of mutual guilt. When the door opened, Dr. Weiss walked out without looking at him. Ishida followed, nodding approvingly as if a deal was sealed. Kenji was reassigned to oversee the facility's cold storage division. It sounded harmless, but he quickly realized it meant cataloging the remains of experiments. Each body was tagged, frozen, and recorded. Rows of preserved limbs filled steel shelves like trophies of science gone blind. One evening, while checking serial numbers, he noticed a missing tag. In its place was a handwritten note: "File removed for German collaboration sample." The word sample made him nauseous. He started to understand that the Germans weren't visitors anymore. They were partners in what Japan planned next. Rumors spread among lower staff that Berlin had rejected official association with Unit 731. Yet the collaboration continued privately. Ishida seemed proud of that secrecy, calling it proof of superiority. Kenji overheard technicians saying that Japan was pushing beyond what the Reich dared to do. The Germans acted as witnesses, collecting data while pretending to disapprove. It was a quiet exchange of moral currency, condemnation traded for results. Kenji felt disgust mixed with fear. Every time he handled a report, he imagined the faces behind each number erased for progress. That week, a German translator approached Kenji discreetly, asking for clarifications in the reports. The man's tone hinted at fear rather than curiosity. He said Dr. Weiss wanted certain sections rewritten to appear sanitized. Kenji realized they were rewriting history before it was even finished. When he refused, the translator warned him that cooperation ensured survival. The word survival struck him deeply. It had become the base currency of the camp. Everyone traded conscience for more days alive. Kenji returned to his room, his hands still smelling of ethanol and guilt. One evening, Kenji found a half-burned letter on his desk. The handwriting was German, signed by Weiss, addressed to Ishida. It praised the precision of Japan's test results and requested more human endurance studies. The last line was smudged, but the translation made his heart pound. "Our nation would not permit such boldness, but history will thank you for it." He burned the letter in his lamp flame and watched the ashes drift across his papers. That night, the sound of weeping echoed faintly from the hallway, quickly silenced by boots. Aiko appeared again, standing by the supply room. Her face was pale, her nurse's cap gone. She whispered that she had been reassigned to waste disposal, which meant handling the bodies. Her eyes avoided his. She said she couldn't bear it anymore and wanted to escape. Kenji told her it was impossible. The perimeter guards shot anyone who approached the fence. She pressed something into his hand, a small torn paycheck from her old life, saying it reminded her that she was once a person. Then she walked away before he could respond. The following morning, the Germans requested another closed demonstration. Ishida ordered all medical officers to attend. Kenji stood at the back as Dr. Weiss observed from the corner. The demonstration involved exposure to extreme cold followed by attempted resuscitation. The subject didn't survive. Ishida called it a noble death for science. Weiss looked away, but his assistant took notes quickly. When it ended, applause followed like a reflex. Kenji felt hollow. Later, he saw Weiss leave the room wiping his face, as though disgust and fascination were fighting for control. After the demonstration, Ishida dismissed everyone except Kenji. He told him the Germans were impressed and expected faster results. Then he warned him that rumors about dissent among staff had reached command. Ishida's voice stayed calm, but his eyes didn't blink once. Kenji nodded obediently, but inside, panic grew. Once the colonel suspected you were already halfway erased. That night, Kenji sneaked into the records office. Files were piled in wooden cabinets labeled archived. He began searching for documents that carried his forged signature, hoping to remove them all. In the bottom drawer, he found a folder labeled Weiss Correspondence. It contained letters, photos, and lists of materials shared between Berlin and Manchuria. One sheet described joint studies of tissue regeneration through cryogenic exposure. The line beneath it mentioned Sato's technique, verified. His name again, placed where it didn't belong. He stuffed the documents into his coat. As he turned to leave, he heard footsteps approaching. Without time to hide, he slid the letters into his boot and pretended to organize the shelves. The door opened, revealing Ishida himself. Ishida stared at him without speaking. After a pause, he simply asked why Kenji was working late. Kenji replied that he was checking storage inventory. Ishida studied his face for a long moment, then smiled faintly and said, "You're loyal, that's why I trust you." Then he left. Kenji's body went rigid until the footsteps faded. Once alone, he exhaled and left through the back corridor. Outside, the air felt sharp and dry. He buried the letters beneath a snowdrift near the generator shed, marking the spot with a small branch. The next morning, alarms blared through the facility. A prisoner had escaped. Guards swarmed the yard, dogs barking, searchlights cutting across the snow. Kenji stood among the staff, pretending confusion. Ishida shouted orders from the balcony, demanding the fugitive be found alive. Hours passed before a gunshot echoed from the forest. When soldiers dragged the body back, Kenji saw the prisoner was one of Aiko's assigned disposal workers. Her absence was noticed immediately. The colonel announced that she had fled with stolen materials. Kenji understood the lie. It was her punishment for humanity. That night, Kenji couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk staring at the torn paycheck Aiko had given him. The paper smelled faintly of disinfectant and smoke. He thought about how she might have looked in the forest before the bullet reached her. The wind rattled the shutters, sounding like whispered warnings. He opened his notebook and wrote a new line in code. "Truth dies slower than bodies." Before closing it, he paused and added another sentence meant for no one but himself. Then he hid the notebook inside the wall vent again. Before dawn, Kenji burned his coded notes from the week, keeping only the ledger hidden in the wall. He wanted to erase any link between him and the forged signatures, but part of him couldn't destroy everything. He kept the torn paycheck folded inside his pocket. It felt like a promise he couldn't explain, a reminder of the only kindness left in that place. Outside, snow kept falling. The chimneys burned non-stop, feeding the illusion that the base was just another cold-weather hospital. To anyone passing by, it looked perfectly normal. A new supply truck arrived, carrying crates labeled medical uniforms. When Kenji helped unload them, one crate fell open. Inside were mud-caked shoes and civilian clothing, not medical supplies. He recognized one pair of shoes. They belonged to a villager who had been brought in last week. The mud wasn't from the village roads. It was thick with laboratory clay, mixed with chemicals. That night he followed the path the truck had taken and reached the basement loading area. The doors were chained from outside, and faint metallic sounds came from within. He knew entering the basement was forbidden. But curiosity outweighed fear. He pried one of the small vents open and peered through. The air carried a strong chemical sting, and rows of covered tables lined the floor. Movement inside suggested someone was still alive, or at least still being used. He closed the vent quietly and walked away, trembling. When he returned to his room, a note had been slipped under his door. It contained only 5 words in red pencil. "They used your name again." Kenji rushed to the records room. A new report had been added to the files overnight, detailing chemical exposure resilience tests. The signature at the bottom was his own. The date and time matched his shift, but he hadn't been there. He felt the walls closing in. Whoever was orchestrating this wanted him as the scapegoat. The more he resisted, the deeper he was being buried. He returned to his quarters and tore the forged page into pieces, flushing it down the drain before realizing that destroying evidence would only prove guilt. By afternoon, the German visitors began packing their equipment. Their departure was sudden, without ceremony. Dr. Weiss met Ishida outside the main gate. The two exchanged a brief handshake, and Weiss whispered something that made Ishida smirk. The convoy left in silence. Kenji watched from the balcony, realizing the Germans had gathered everything they needed and wanted distance before what came next. He expected relief, but instead felt dread. The base had no more witnesses, and that meant Ishida could act without foreign eyes. Within hours of their departure, Ishida announced a new order. Phase 2 experiments would begin immediately. The phrase Phase 2 circulated like a curse. It meant the tests were expanding to include rural populations. Kenji's department was reassigned to data processing. His new job was to compile reports from field units without asking questions. Each report listed dozens of names, labeled only as subjects. As he typed, he saw that most came from nearby villages: men, women, children. The detachment of numbers and dates made the crimes look clean. That night, a soldier arrived at his room carrying another forged file. He said Ishida needed the data signed before morning. Kenji recognized the pattern immediately. The file described experiments he had never conducted. The soldier said it was urgent, that the colonel trusted only him. Kenji stared at the man's trembling hands. Fear was written across his face. The soldier wasn't complicit. He was terrified. Kenji signed with a single false stroke, then added a small mark in the margin, his secret way of identifying forgeries later. The following day, new guards replaced the old ones. Security doubled. All mail and communication were halted. Ishida told the staff that national secrecy must be protected. The atmosphere changed. Even the sound of footsteps felt heavier. One technician whispered that the Germans had taken copies of every experiment before leaving. Kenji wondered if his name was attached to all of them. He began memorizing key file codes, hoping one day to reveal the truth. But even as he planned, he felt the invisible noose tightening. When Kenji entered the data hall, he found 2 officers waiting. They questioned him about missing documents from the records office. He denied everything, but they already knew. One officer produced a folder with fragments of burned paper, his handwriting visible on the edges. They asked why he was destroying evidence. Kenji said nothing. Silence was safer than lies. They left him with a warning. Loyalty keeps you breathing. He realized that from now on, every word, every glance could be his last mistake. That evening he sat alone at his desk, reviewing files under the dim lamp. A report marked German Cooperation Extension caught his eye. The summary mentioned new research methods shared between Berlin and Tokyo. He read the list carefully and froze when he reached the bottom. The proposed experiments bore his signature again, alongside Dr. Weiss's. His name had become both shield and weapon. He closed the folder, looked out the window at the frozen horizon, and understood that silence could no longer save him or anyone else in that place. Kenji began keeping his confession in a small diary, hidden inside a microscope base. Each night, after the lights dimmed, he wrote down everything: the orders, the lies, the forged files. He described how names turned into numbers, how life was recorded as data. Writing gave him a fragile sense of control, though he knew it could cost him everything if found. He imagined someone someday reading those words and understanding that he had tried to resist, but every new entry only deepened the realization that truth itself had no place here. The following morning, Ishida ordered surprise inspections again. Officers raided dorms, searching for contraband and foreign correspondence. Kenji returned from the lab to find his mattress sliced open, drawers emptied, clothes scattered. The microscope, however, sat untouched on the shelf, dusty and ordinary. He brushed the surface gently, feeling the hidden weight beneath. When Ishida entered his room later, he asked if Kenji felt loyal to the Empire. Kenji nodded without hesitation. Ishida smiled and said loyalty would soon be tested through a new assignment of national importance. Kenji's new order required him to oversee plague transmission experiments. The goal was to measure infection spread among test groups. He realized the subjects were prisoners from nearby villages. Refusal meant death, so he accepted silently. During preparation, he replaced the intended bacterial strain with diluted saline to spare them. Days later, Ishida confronted him with reports of inconsistent results. Kenji claimed a temperature error. Ishida said nothing but left a single bullet on his desk, a wordless reminder of consequences. That night, Kenji vomited outside, realizing mercy was becoming treason. A week later, whispers spread that Dr. Weiss had been seen in Harbin under Japanese escort. No one believed it, but Kenji suspected it was true. Weiss had not left, he had simply changed uniforms. The thought made him sick. It meant their alliance had turned into something darker, an unspoken competition of cruelty. If both nations were feeding each other's obsessions, there was no stopping it. Kenji considered writing to the German embassy but knew every letter was screened. Even thoughts felt monitored in that compound of locked eyes and guarded words. Snow covered the camp, dulling every sound. Kenji stood at a window, watching guards light cigarettes near the fence. He realized he hadn't seen a bird in weeks. The land felt stripped of all natural life. For a brief moment he imagined leaving, walking until his lungs froze, vanishing into white. But he couldn't. He still carried names in his memory, people erased on paper but not in his conscience. He promised himself that if he couldn't save them, he would at least make sure their suffering wasn't buried in silence. Days later, Ishida summoned Kenji to headquarters. A new experiment phase required reliable supervision. Kenji was told he would oversee plague injections directly. His stomach turned. Refusing would expose him. Obeying would destroy him. Ishida handed him a sealed folder with the procedure outline and said, "You understand the duty of loyalty." The words felt like a noose. Kenji took the folder, nodding, knowing his every reaction was being studied. Back in the lab, he stared at the file until sunrise, trying to find a way to survive without losing his soul. When the day of testing arrived, Kenji prepared the materials as instructed but swapped the samples again. He injected the captives with saline, labeling each as infected. The supervising officer seemed satisfied. For a few hours, he believed he had succeeded. But later that evening, Ishida appeared with 2 soldiers, demanding retesting. Kenji's chest tightened. The colonel watched as another officer repeated the procedure using undiluted cultures. One by one, the captives collapsed. Ishida turned toward Kenji and said, "Now we know who falsified the data." He smiled faintly and walked away. Kenji expected arrest that night, but it never came. Instead, a new report circulated with corrected results, signed by him again. They had rewritten everything. The truth was gone, replaced by an official version where he had done exactly what they wanted. The realization crushed him more than punishment would have. He no longer existed as a person, only as a name on documents justifying horror. He sat alone in his quarters, staring at the revolver Ishida had left on his desk. Even his death would serve as evidence of discipline. The following day, Kenji learned from another officer that the colonel had praised his dedication to progress. It was a performance, an illusion of reward that masked surveillance. Everyone around him acted like puppets, moving carefully to avoid being cut. He noticed others watching him more closely, recording his movements. Paranoia turned into routine. He couldn't tell who still thought, who only obeyed. In the compound, silence had become language. People spoke in nods, glances, or not at all. Obedience had devoured fear, leaving only emptiness behind their faces. During a rare free hour, Kenji walked through the administrative wing. A cleaner had left an open door, revealing the communications office. He stepped inside, pretending to search for a document. On the desk lay telegraph forms written in German. The messages referenced joint results secured. He copied part of one note, memorizing the numbers and codes before leaving. Those few seconds of risk filled him with renewed purpose. He didn't know what he would do with that knowledge yet, but it felt like holding a small weapon against a giant lie. That night, Kenji entered the morgue to confirm reports. As he reviewed tags, one name stopped him, Aiko Tanaka. His chest felt hollow. She had been listed as Subject 73141, marked for organ preservation. He traced the tag with shaking fingers, realizing she had become part of their record-keeping. He stood there for minutes, staring at the body wrapped in linen, trying to recognize anything familiar. Then he pulled her tag free and slipped it into his pocket. It wasn't courage. It was the only act of resistance left to him. Kenji returned to his quarters and placed Aiko's tag beside the torn paycheck. Together they formed a story. Her name and her life reduced to 2 fragile items. He realized that everything he valued existed only in stolen fragments. The empire, the research, the duty, all of it felt like scaffolding built over a grave. He opened his diary and wrote one line. "Every discovery here is a confession written in someone else's blood." He stopped writing afterward, staring at the words until the candle burned out on its own. A week later, the Germans returned. Their trucks rolled into the yard unannounced, carrying new equipment. Ishida greeted them as if nothing unusual had happened. Dr. Weiss stepped out, now wearing a Japanese-issued uniform. He looked colder, more mechanical. The collaboration had evolved into something seamless. Vice explained that Berlin wanted film documentation of the facility. Cameras were installed in the labs to record scientific processes, but Kenji noticed they only filmed instruments and graphs, never the people behind the suffering. History was being edited even as it happened. Kenji was instructed to appear in one of the recordings, presenting research data. The film crew focused on his face, capturing his calm professionalism. He realized they wanted an image, a respectable doctor proving Japan's progress. Later, Weiss congratulated him for his composure. The compliment felt like poison. That night, Kenji dreamt of standing before a camera that recorded nothing but silence while the world pretended not to see. He woke with the image burned into his mind, understanding that the film would become their defense long after the victims were gone. Days passed without new tests, giving the illusion of normalcy. Kenji spent the evenings alone, reading from his diary and whispering the names he remembered. Each name felt like a pulse against the numbness. He wondered if memory itself was a form of rebellion. He began hiding small clues in his official paperwork, tiny discrepancies in data that might draw future suspicion. It was a quiet act, invisible to everyone but him. For the first time in months, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, even if no one would ever notice. Late one night, he sneaked into the archive room. He had memorized guard rotations and used his stolen key to unlock the filing cabinet. Inside were detailed reports of experiments labeled under both Japanese and German seals. He photographed pages using a smuggled camera from a supply shipment. Each click of the shutter felt louder than gunfire. He finished quickly and hid the film inside the lining of his coat. As he left, a voice behind him said, "Working late again, Doctor." He turned to see one of Ishida's guards staring coldly. Kenji froze but managed to hand the guard a folded note with cash inside. The guard looked down, then back at him. "I didn't see anything," the man said quietly. Kenji nodded, pretending calm while his pulse hammered beneath the surface. He walked away without looking back. When he reached his room, he hid the camera and negatives beneath the floorboard. He sat on the bed for hours, listening to distant machinery humming through the walls. It no longer sounded like engines, it sounded like breathing that never stopped. The next morning, the guard who had spared him was gone. His post was empty, replaced by another man. When Kenji asked about him, no one answered. His absence spoke for itself. That night, officers searched the dorms again. Kenji's door was kicked open, drawers turned inside out. They found nothing, but the message was clear. He was being watched constantly. He understood then that the base wasn't only a prison for its captives but for its own staff. Everyone was a subject under observation, trapped inside the experiment of obedience. After the search, Kenji checked his hiding spot. The camera was still there, but the negatives were missing. Panic struck hard. He searched every inch of the floor, the mattress, the vent. Gone. Whoever had taken them hadn't left a trace. He realized the theft wasn't random. Someone wanted him alive but powerless. Destroying the evidence would make his testimony meaningless later. For the first time, he considered escaping, but the memory of those shot at the fence stopped him. He had no allies, no proof, and no one left to trust. The next day, Ishida called a staff meeting. He spoke of honor, sacrifice, and silence. Then he announced that unpatriotic elements had attempted to compromise operations. Everyone knew what that meant. 2 technicians were dragged from the line and executed outside. Their deaths restored order through terror. Kenji felt sick but kept his eyes fixed forward like everyone else. When Ishida dismissed the crowd, he turned toward Kenji and said, "The loyal have nothing to fear." The words rang hollow. Fear had already become the only thing keeping anyone loyal. Winter deepened, and the camp shifted to Stage 2 operations. The goal was to expand testing beyond the base. Field units prepared to release controlled samples in rural villages. Kenji was ordered to provide logistical data, not participate. He complied outwardly while altering figures to reduce targets. On paper, it looked efficient. In practice, fewer people were captured. Ishida praised his precision, unaware of the sabotage. For a brief time, Kenji felt he was saving lives without being noticed. But every act of defiance made him feel one step closer to discovery. The deception couldn't last. Ishida demanded progress updates faster than Kenji could fabricate. To buy time, Kenji created duplicate reports showing consistent numbers. His falsified data passed review, but the effort drained him. Each night, he slept less, haunted by the thought of villagers who might still be taken. In the halls, whispers grew that the project was facing pressure from Tokyo to accelerate results. The sense of urgency infected everyone. Mistakes increased, tempers rose, and people vanished without reason. The base had become a self-consuming machine. A snowstorm trapped the staff inside for 3 days. Supplies ran low and tempers broke. Kenji overheard officers arguing in the mess hall, blaming the Germans for stealing their research. Ishida dismissed the talk but looked uneasy. The alliance that once empowered them now felt like a curse. The Germans had taken their secrets and left them to face whatever came next. Kenji understood that his only hope was to preserve enough evidence to expose everything later, but with communication sealed, the outside world might never even learn this place existed. When the storm cleared, Kenji received a telegram bearing Berlin's seal, delivered through military channels. It was addressed directly to him. The message was brief. Continue your cooperation. Progress is commendable. Results will be remembered. There was no signature, only the letter W. His blood chilled as he recognized it. Weiss was alive, still part of this project, sending orders as if he were a superior. Kenji realized then that the alliance had merged into something global. It wasn't one army or another anymore. It was science turned into ideology. He hid the telegram inside his diary and sat for hours without moving. The snow outside had turned gray with ash from the chimneys. Everything around him felt hollow, mechanical, beyond redemption. Yet something inside refused to die. He decided that before this place consumed him, he would find a way to send his records out. Maybe he couldn't stop the empire, but he could make sure its truth survived. He looked out at the frozen horizon and whispered a single thought he couldn't write down. They can't erase everything. The next morning, Kenji was called to the operations office. Ishida handed him a new assignment. He would accompany a field unit to gather samples from infected sites. The trip meant leaving the compound for the first time in months. He accepted, hiding both relief and fear. Outside the gates, the landscape looked lifeless, entire villages erased by frost and silence. The soldiers joked about the subjects they would collect, but Kenji stayed quiet, staring at burned houses and discarded clothes half buried in snow. This was what their data looked like in real life. When they reached the outskirts of a ruined village, the stench of disease hung heavy. The soldiers searched through homes, dragging out survivors to be examined. Kenji pretended to record findings while secretly marking survivors as deceased to spare them capture. One boy hid behind a collapsed wall, shaking. Kenji looked at him and whispered to run when the guards turned. The boy fled into the trees. No one noticed except the sergeant, who stared at Kenji but said nothing. They returned to the trucks with crates labeled samples secured. Back at the base, Ishida reviewed the report and commended Kenji's efficiency. He said Tokyo was impressed with his precision and that promotion was possible. The praise felt rotten. Kenji knew every compliment was another layer of control. That night, he received a small parcel in his quarters, a photograph of him standing beside soldiers in the village, smiling. He hadn't smiled. The image had been altered. The message was clear. They controlled not only his name but his face, his truth, his history. His identity now belonged to the empire. Kenji stayed awake until dawn, staring at the falsified photo. He flipped it over and saw a faint stamp. Press Department, Imperial Documentation Division. The military was preparing to publicize their medical success. His forged smile would soon represent their progress. He realized then that silence was no longer an option. He had to act, even if it meant death. He pulled out the hidden negatives he had recovered from the microscope base. There were only 2 left. Images of labeled organs and numbered corpses. Proof, fragile but real. Morning brought deceptive calm. The snow glittered, the yard buzzed with drills, and the smell of disinfectant replaced the usual smoke. Kenji stood near the window, watching technicians carry boxes into trucks. He wondered where those boxes would end up. Tokyo, Berlin, or buried in ice. For a brief moment, he felt the stillness before the storm. His hands rested on the windowsill, cold and steady. He told himself that his life no longer mattered, only the record of what he had seen. He whispered inwardly, a promise to protect the truth. He began planning his escape. Every corridor, every guard shift, every timing between patrols. He couldn't leave yet, but he could prepare. He wrote 2 letters, one confession, one decoy report, and sealed them together inside his coat lining. The real confession was written in code, identical to his earlier notes. If caught, they would never notice. He bribed a truck driver with a pack of cigarettes to deliver the envelope to a friend in Harbin. The driver nodded, but Kenji knew trust was a luxury. Every alliance here was made of fear. Before the driver could leave, a blizzard hit. The roads closed, and all transport halted under Ishida's orders. The storm howled for 2 days, burying vehicles and communication lines. Kenji sat in his room listening to the wind whip against the shutters. The trapped base felt smaller with every hour. Soldiers argued in the halls and whispers of revolt surfaced. Some wanted to flee south, others wanted to destroy the evidence and disappear. Kenji knew chaos could be his chance, but chaos in this place always ended in blood. Once the storm cleared, Ishida held a meeting in the mess hall. He announced that Stage 3 of the experiments would begin, expanding operations under German consultation. Everyone clapped mechanically. Then he introduced the new proposal bearing Kenji's name and Dr. Weiss's as co-authors. Kenji's vision blurred as he read the title, Airborne Pathogen Dissemination Trials. He had never written it, but his forged signature was perfect. Ishida said the project would make history. Kenji realized he had just been chosen to take the blame for something unimaginable. In private, Kenji confronted Ishida. The colonel listened quietly, expression blank. Then he told Kenji that history only remembered victors, not victims. "You will be remembered as a patriot," he said. The phrase sounded like an execution order. Kenji understood there was no way out except one. He left the office with the signed document in hand, feeling its weight as though it were a death sentence. When he reached his room, he added a tiny symbol next to his name on the signature, his mark of defiance hidden in plain sight. That evening, soldiers began inspecting every quarter for unauthorized material again. Kenji had only minutes to hide his diary and negatives. He slid the diary into the air vent, wrapping it inside the torn paycheck. The photographs went under the floorboards. When the officers entered, he stood calmly as they searched. They found nothing. One of them glanced at him and said, "The loyal ones always sleep easily." Kenji smiled faintly, though sleep had long become impossible. After they left, he leaned against the wall, hearing muffled screams from another room. The following morning, he received a summons to the command hall. Ishida sat at a long table with senior officers. They praised his dedication and formally promoted him to project supervisor. The room applauded as if celebrating victory. Kenji stood still, feeling hollow. The title meant nothing. It was a crown for the condemned. As he left the hall, a soldier handed him a folder labeled Implementation Orders. He opened it briefly, scanning the contents. Maps of rural drop sites. Each red circle represented a place where death would soon be tested. He returned to his office and drafted an alternate version of the orders, adjusting coordinates to isolated mountain areas where no one lived. It was a small act, invisible sabotage disguised as obedience. His hand trembled slightly as he stamped it with his seal. The new copies would reach Tokyo by the next courier. He knew it wouldn't stop everything, but maybe it would slow them down. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to hope that his quiet rebellion might actually save lives no one would ever know about. That night, guards began conducting integrity checks on officers. They searched desks, lockers, and even uniforms. Kenji overheard whispers that Tokyo feared leaks. The Germans had supposedly duplicated all data, and someone inside was accused of sending information abroad. He realized the investigation would expose everything, including his falsified coordinates. He needed to act fast. He retrieved the diary from the vent, wrapped it in plastic, and sealed it behind the generator panel. It wasn't safe, but it was far from his quarters. His life was already beyond safe measures. Just after midnight, gunfire erupted near the barracks. Alarms wailed, and soldiers shouted orders. Word spread that a prisoner had escaped again and stolen a weapon. Kenji ran outside, blending with the crowd. Smoke rose from the far side of the yard. The chaos gave him cover to reach the generator shed. Inside, heat and noise filled the air. He crouched behind the panel, making sure the diary was secure. As he stood, an explosion shook the ground, throwing him against the wall. The base was coming apart. Flames spread quickly, devouring the wooden roofs and corridors. Kenji stumbled into the snow, coughing, his coat singed. Officers shouted conflicting orders. Some tried to save documents, others fled toward vehicles. The sky turned orange as chemical stores ignited, filling the air with acrid smoke. Through the haze, he saw Ishida directing soldiers to protect the archives, screaming at them to save Japan's legacy. The words struck Kenji like a curse. The legacy they built was ashes, and he wanted it buried. He turned away, searching for an exit in the blinding smoke. He found a half-collapsed storage tunnel leading toward the supply depot. Crawling through the debris, he heard explosions echo above. The walls creaked, dust falling into his eyes. At the end of the tunnel, a broken steel door opened into freezing air. He climbed out into a snowfield illuminated by burning buildings. Behind him, the compound roared like a dying beast. He didn't look back. Every step felt heavier, but each breath reminded him he was still alive. Survival wasn't victory, but it was the only thing left to claim. Reaching the forest edge, he collapsed in the snow. His coat was torn, and frost bit into his fingers. In the distance, the compound burned brighter than sunrise. He watched it fall piece by piece, walls crumbling, towers cracking, flames devouring evidence faster than any confession could. Somewhere inside, Ishida's voice still echoed faintly through loudspeakers, ordering a defense no one was obeying. Kenji pressed his hands into the snow, leaving red stains that disappeared instantly. For the first time, the world outside the fence felt like part of the living again. He trudged through the forest until his legs failed. The night was silent except for distant crackling from the fire. He found an abandoned shed and crawled inside, shivering. The smell of damp wood filled his lungs. From his coat pocket, he pulled Aiko's paycheck and the identification tag he had kept. He laid them beside him on the floor, staring at them as if they could still speak. He whispered an apology he couldn't finish. Somewhere beyond the trees, the wind carried faint echoes of collapsing metal and dying orders. At dawn, smoke from the base drifted over the horizon. Kenji stumbled toward a frozen river, hoping to follow it to a nearby village. His boots cracked through the thin ice, soaking his feet. He didn't care. Hunger gnawed at him, but the thought of freedom felt strange, almost unreal. He had lived so long surrounded by walls that open space felt like exposure. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps behind him. When he reached the riverbank, he looked back one last time. The compound was gone, replaced by gray haze. He followed the river for hours before collapsing near a barn at the edge of a village. The farmer inside found him unconscious and dragged him to shelter. When Kenji woke, the man stared silently, offering water. He didn't ask who he was. Everyone already feared the uniform. Kenji removed his insignia and muttered that he was a doctor. The farmer nodded but kept his distance. Outside, the fields were covered in soot carried from the burned facility. Even the snow here carried the residue of what had been done. The farmer let him stay in the barn overnight. As darkness fell, Kenji wrote in the margins of a discarded newspaper summarizing his confession from memory. He tore the page and slipped it under a floorboard, whispering that someone someday might find it. His handwriting shook from exhaustion, but the words were clear enough to outlive him. He knew he couldn't keep running. The Empire would call him a deserter, maybe even a traitor. But the thought no longer scared him. Truth mattered more than belonging to something rotten. The next morning, he woke to the distant hum of engines. Soldiers were moving through the village, conducting searches. The farmer urged him to leave, pointing toward the woods. Kenji hid the paper again and thanked him silently before slipping away. He moved through the forest, avoiding main roads. Every branch snap felt too loud. He followed animal tracks north, heading nowhere in particular. His only goal was distance from the Empire, from science twisted into power, from the ghosts that still lived behind the fence of Unit 731. Days later, exhaustion forced him to stop. He built a small shelter from branches and snow, surviving on melted ice and whatever he could scavenge. Each night, he dreamed of faces he never saved. In some dreams, Aiko stood by the frost chambers, whispering his name. In others, Ishida's laughter echoed over a burning sky. He woke each morning wondering if he had actually escaped or if this wilderness was just another cage. The difference no longer mattered. Both were prisons built by men chasing control. When he finally reached a remote checkpoint, soldiers stopped him. They recognized his uniform and demanded identification. His forged papers claimed he was part of a sanitation team. The officer scanned them, then waved him through, uninterested. As he crossed the gate, Kenji felt the first breath of relief in months. Beyond that checkpoint lay uncertainty. Enemy territory or safety he didn't know. But he had made it out. Every step forward felt like betrayal and redemption intertwined, the line between victim and accomplice blurring with every crunch of snow beneath his boots. That night he built a small fire in an abandoned hut and unwrapped his coat. Hidden within the lining was the second envelope, the decoy report. Inside it he found the real coded confession. He read the first line aloud. "If this survives, let it bear witness." The firelight flickered across his tired face as he smiled faintly, not from joy, but from the strange calm of finally choosing his side. Tomorrow, he would find someone to take it. Tomorrow, the truth would start its long journey beyond the ashes of Manchuria. Morning arrived gray and silent. Kenji walked along a dirt path leading toward an abandoned railway station. He carried the envelope under his coat, pressed close to his chest. The station was deserted except for stray dogs and rusting carts. A faded map still hung on the wall, marked with routes to Harbin and beyond. He thought of slipping the letter into the supply train heading west, but the sound of boots behind him made him freeze. Soldiers were approaching, searching the area for escapees. He hid behind a crate, heart steady but alert. The soldiers searched the station methodically. Kenji stayed still, barely breathing. One of them opened a nearby crate and found nothing but old rags. As they moved on, he noticed a mail sack lying by the loading dock. It still carried the imperial seal. When they left, Kenji slid from his hiding place, slipped his envelope inside the bag and sealed it shut. The act was quiet, almost ceremonial. He didn't know who would find it, but he whispered a small prayer that someone, somewhere, would read the truth written in his hand. He left the station before the next patrol arrived. His path led through a forest road lined with blackened trees, remnants of bombing runs, snow mixed with ash under his boots. Every landmark felt erased, leaving only memory to guide him. He wondered if the envelope would survive, or if it would burn like everything else tied to the Empire's secrets. Yet the thought gave him purpose. Even if he vanished, the story would live. He was no longer running for his life, but carrying the last voice of those who couldn't. By nightfall, Kenji reached a small mining village. The people were thin, their faces gray from hunger and smoke. When he asked for water, no one spoke. They recognized his uniform and stepped back. Finally, an old woman handed him a bowl. Her eyes carried quiet accusation but no hatred. He drank slowly, ashamed. He noticed a radio on her table crackling faintly, reporting that Allied forces had advanced in the Pacific. The Empire was faltering. Hope and ruin had begun to share the same sky, and neither brought peace. The next day he continued walking north, avoiding main roads. The landscape turned harsher, fields frozen and empty. He found an abandoned church and rested inside. The wooden pews were cracked, but one wall still held a crucifix. He sat beneath it, not to pray but to think. The building smelled of dust and time. He imagined the people who once came here to seek forgiveness. What forgiveness could exist for men like him? He reached into his coat and touched Aiko's tag, whispering her name until exhaustion took him. Snowfall began again, soft and endless. Kenji awoke with frost clinging to his hair. The world outside was pure white, as if trying to erase itself. He stepped outside and followed the road toward a distant plume of smoke. The closer he walked, the clearer the sound of engines became, military trucks. He ducked into a ditch and watched a convoy pass. The soldiers were Japanese, escorting captured Chinese civilians. The sight struck him like déjà vu. Nothing had ended. The machinery of cruelty still moved, even as the Empire's walls cracked. He followed the convoy from a distance, careful not to be seen. At the rear, he saw a young medic adjusting his gloves. Someone who reminded him of himself years earlier. The medic's eyes were distant, empty. Kenji realized he was watching another man at the beginning of the same descent. When the truck stopped at a checkpoint, Kenji turned away. He couldn't interfere, it would change nothing. Yet he couldn't stop picturing the medic's face, wondering if one day that man would look back and see the same sins reflected. Night brought exhaustion. He reached an old farmhouse and took shelter in the cellar. The smell of damp hay filled the air. He lit a match and saw shelves stacked with glass jars, preserved food untouched for years. He ate quietly, then pulled out his diary. The last pages were almost full. He wrote about the convoy, the medic, and the fire that had devoured the base. His handwriting grew faint near the bottom of the page. He ended with one line: "History repeats because no one listens while it's being written." The next morning, distant thunder echoed. Planes passed overhead, their silhouettes slicing through the gray clouds. Bombing raids had begun again. Kenji stayed inside until silence returned. When he stepped outside, the horizon glowed red where another town burned. He wondered if the world even deserved to know the truth he carried. Maybe humanity preferred ignorance. It was easier than looking at what progress truly cost. Yet he continued walking, one step after another, because giving up now would mean admitting that every life lost had been for nothing. He reached a frozen river crossing manned by retreating soldiers. They were burning documents, throwing boxes of records into the water. Kenji approached cautiously and offered to help, pretending to be from headquarters. One officer handed him a bundle of papers, saying, "Orders from Manchuria, burn them fast." Kenji's pulse steadied. He took the papers to the fire pit, opened them slightly, and recognized the stamp of Unit 731. Before tossing them in, he slipped one page into his coat, a final piece of proof that the facility had existed. By dusk, the soldiers abandoned the checkpoint. Kenji remained until the fires died out. The hidden page felt heavy in his coat. He unfolded it under the fading light. It listed material transfers between Japan and Germany, signed by both nations' scientific liaisons. The evidence confirmed what he had feared. Their alliance wasn't temporary. It was structural. Science had become currency between monsters. He folded the paper again, sealing it inside his diary. He promised himself he'd find a way to deliver it, even if it cost the rest of his strength. He reached a small village at the base of the mountains. The people were cautious, but offered him food when he said he was a doctor. They spoke of sickness spreading from the south, soldiers collapsing without warning. Kenji realized it was the same plague they had created in the lab, now beyond control. His heart sank. What they unleashed had come full circle. That night he treated a sick child using herbs and boiled water, the only tools available. The child survived, and for the first time in years Kenji cried. At dawn, soldiers entered the village demanding medical help. They recognized Kenji's name and took him by force, claiming he was needed for urgent national recovery. He didn't resist. They loaded him into a truck with wounded men, heading toward the coast. Along the road, he saw cities in ruins, bridges shattered, civilians scavenging for food. The empire he had served was dying, but it was taking everyone with it. When the truck stopped for fuel, Kenji overheard that the Americans were closing in. Japan's silence would soon meet judgment. As the convoy approached a port city, air raid sirens wailed. Explosions tore through the docks, scattering soldiers and civilians alike. The truck flipped, throwing Kenji into debris. He crawled through smoke, bleeding but conscious. Amid the chaos, he saw military officers burning crates marked 731 Research. He grabbed one paper that flew loose, stuffing it into his coat. It didn't matter which one, it was proof. He stumbled toward the sea, the sound of planes above blending with screams below. The Empire's final purge of truth had already begun. When the bombing stopped, Kenji found shelter beneath a collapsed pier. He pressed his back against a beam, shivering as waves lapped at the shore. The paper in his coat was soaked but intact. He looked up at the distant horizon and felt no victory, only fatigue. Everything he had witnessed, written and hidden, was scattered across ruined land. He closed his eyes and whispered, "At least some of it will survive." The wind carried salt into his lungs, stinging and clean, as if the world was trying to wash itself. Days later, Allied troops occupied the port. Kenji was captured with other survivors and interrogated. He said nothing. The officers asked about Unit 731, but he denied knowing its location. They didn't believe him, yet they couldn't prove otherwise. He was placed in a temporary holding camp, surrounded by soldiers from both sides. Every night, he listened to the waves crashing beyond the fence and wondered if anyone would ever uncover what had really happened in Manchuria. Silence, once his prison, had now become his last protection. A month passed. Rumors spread that high-ranking officials were negotiating with the Americans. Some said the Empire's scientists were offering research data in exchange for immunity. Kenji's chest tightened at the thought. His diary, his letters, his proof, all of it might mean nothing if the world preferred deals over justice. One night, he tore a scrap of paper from a ration packet and wrote a single sentence: "They are buying peace with bodies." He buried it under the camp fence, unsure if anyone would ever read it. When his turn for transfer came, a military doctor examined him and noted his poor health. Instead of Tokyo, he was sent to a rural medical facility for recovery. The hospital looked peaceful, surrounded by rice fields untouched by war. But the nurses avoided eye contact, and the guards outside carried American rifles. He realized this wasn't a hospital, it was containment. The world wanted silence, not confessions. Still, he continued writing in secret, recording everything from memory, even though each word felt like scratching history onto water. Months later, the war officially ended. Radios across the country announced surrender. The empire had fallen. In the hospital, no one cheered. People just stared at the floor, unsure how to live without orders. Kenji sat by the window, watching nurses remove imperial flags from the courtyard. He wondered how long it would take before the world started rewriting this chapter into something clean. He took out the final sheet from his diary and wrote, "Peace is not silence. It's what begins after truth is heard." Then he hid it under his bed. Years passed quietly. Kenji lived under a new identity, working as a clinic doctor in a small town. Patients called him kind, never knowing the weight behind his gentle hands. He often walked along the river after work, carrying a small box filled with what little remained of his past: the torn paycheck, Aiko's tag, and a faded photo of the base. Some nights he dreamed of smoke rising again over snow, but it no longer terrified him. It simply reminded him that forgetting was just another form of erasure. One evening, a newspaper headline caught his eye. "Documents reveal wartime experiments in Manchuria." The report mentioned fragments recovered by construction workers. No names, only initials: KS. He sat motionless, staring at the page. His confession had surfaced after all, carried by time and chance. The world would finally know. Yet the article focused more on politics than the victims. He folded the paper neatly, placed it inside his box, and whispered, "At least it's out there." The truth no longer belonged to him. It belonged to whoever dared to read it. He grew older, quieter. The world around him moved on, rebuilding and forgetting. The scars of war became stories, then lessons, then footnotes. He knew that one day even his name would fade, but the thought didn't frighten him. What mattered was that evidence existed somewhere, buried, unearthed, retold. That meant the victims had not vanished completely. Each time the wind passed through the fields outside his clinic, he imagined it carrying faint whispers from the frozen compound, voices that refused to be erased, still asking the same question: why? One winter morning he walked to the river carrying the small box. The water shimmered under pale sunlight. He opened the lid, touched Aiko's tag one last time, and placed it inside the current. It floated for a moment, then sank slowly out of sight. He stood there until the ripples faded. His breath hung in the air like smoke. For the first time since leaving Manchuria, he felt something close to peace. He turned back toward the village, each step lighter than the last, leaving the river to guard her memory. Years later, construction crews working near Harbin uncovered a rusted box beneath frozen soil. Inside were papers in Japanese and German, water-damaged but legible. Historians studied them, tracing the initials KS. The documents described experiments, forged signatures, and collaboration that stretched across oceans. Among the files was a torn paycheck folded around a single note: "Truth dies slower than bodies." The handwriting was faint, but the words resonated like an echo from another century. Reporters called it evidence of atrocities long denied, but to those who read carefully, it felt like a confession. Snow fell again over Manchuria, blanketing the ruins of what once was. The wind moved through the empty foundations of the compound, carrying whispers of what had been done there. The world had changed, but the ground still remembered. Somewhere, hidden in archives and memories, Dr. Kenji Sato's story continued, uncredited, uncelebrated, but alive. The final image was not of fire or blood, but of snow settling gently over the place where truth had once been buried, waiting for someone to look closer and finally see what progress had cost.